It's the Maxwell Institute podcast. I'm Blair Hodges. Over 1.2 billion Muslims, or 1 in 5 people on the planet, read the Quran as the sacred word of God. Syed Hossein Nasr has written, "The Quran is the constant companion of Muslims in the journey of life. Its verses are the first sounds recited into the ears of the newborn child, and its verses are usually the last words that a Muslim hears upon the approach of death. In between these moments, the life of a Muslim is replete with the presence of the Quran." Dr. Nasr is the editor-in-chief of The Study Quran. It's a new translation of the holy book with notes and commentary. General editors Joseph Lumbard, Maria Dakake, and Kainer Dogley, along with assistant editor Muhammad Rustam, spent over a decade on this project. So in this episode, Maria Dakake and Joseph Lumbard joined me to talk about The Study Quran, which is coming out in November of 2015 from HarperOne. Questions and comments about this and other episodes of the Maxwell Institute podcast can be sent to MIPodcast@byu.edu. Maria Dakake and Joseph Lumbard, welcome to the Maxwell Institute podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yes, we're talking about the new Study Quran that's coming out from HarperOne. It's coming out in November. It's a brand new translation of the Quran, and both of you worked as general editors on that project. So I wanted to begin by talking about how you first came to encounter the Quran and how that's changed your life, your faith, and your scholarship. So let's start with Maria.
Yes, I was myself raised Roman Catholic and went through all Roman Catholic schooling, and so had a very extensive introduction and familiarity, of course, with the Bible, biblical texts, which I learned in school and I heard at Mass and other religious services. But when I was in college, I became very interested in Islam, mostly by way, actually, of Middle East politics. I was a government major, and I began studying Arabic, and I began studying a little bit about the Islamic world. And I was taking Arabic classes, although just beginning, and I decided, I really should pick up a copy of this Quran and understand what it says, or try to understand what it says. I'd heard so much about it, but hadn't read it. And so I picked up a translation, of course, because my Arabic was not yet good enough to read the Quran. I'd only just begun learning, and picked it up and began reading, and I read till about the middle of the second surah, which is, a significant chunk into the Quran. And I was really very taken with it, very struck by it, in part because there is such a sense of the immediacy of the voice of the Quran. When one reads the Bible or hears the Bible, with some exceptions, of course, it is often a work of narrative, telling stories, of course, spiritual stories, important stories, but really told in that form, different kinds of narrative. But the Quran was really more of the text itself, as I read it, felt like a voice calling out directly to me. And that is something that not just I have noticed, of course, very commonly understood quality or feature of the Quran is that it does address its audience, often very, very directly. And that struck me. It was very unusual for me. And it was very compelling, in all honesty. But at the same time, it was also a little disturbing to me because I had been raised Catholic, and I for a while put it away after that, but not too long after I picked it back up again. And after reading more of the Quran, I decided to go ahead and read some biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, a little bit about the founding of the Muslim community and the expansion of Islam. And that really began my interest in Islam. And so, and I eventually embraced Islam myself. So in many ways, the Quran was the opening of that door to Islam for me.
How about you, Joseph?
My story is somewhat different than Maria's. I came from a background as an Episcopalian. I was active in church growing up, and like Maria, I had extensive exposure to the Bible. My father was a Sunday school teacher. I acted in church plays, forgot my lines, and all of that fun stuff. And then when I became Muslim, I actually became Muslim more through the presence of other Muslims that I knew, and also through an understanding of the person of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And then it was after I became Muslim that I really started reading the Quran in depth. And so the Quran, you might say, although of course it's the foundation and center axis of the faith in many ways, it wasn't necessarily my first experience of Islam. And then I started to read it more actively. I wasn't even taking Arabic at the time, so I really read it in translation. I was reading the Yusuf Ali translation and the Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall translation. Those were the two that I had an experience with. But one thing that struck me is the way in which the Quran moves around from topic to topic. It's much different than the text of the Bible. It's more of an intimate conversation. And as one penetrates more deeply and fully into the text, it's just like when one gets to know an individual more and one can kind of understand how all of the shifts in conversation continue to relate to one another. And that experience was something that I think is something I continue on to this day as I've learned Arabic and now experience the text in the Arabic language rather than in English. As one goes further and further, every experience of the book really is a deepening of one's relationship, not just with the Word of God, but with God's self.
So both of you have had personal encounter with the Quran that's affected your religious life, and you've also dedicated your life of scholarship to the Quran as well. Let's talk a little bit about the makeup of the Quran itself, a little bit about its origin, how it was revealed and recorded, and then how it's laid out for people who haven't yet read from the Quran. It differs from the Bible in Joseph, as you mentioned, in jumping around, and so let's talk about that. Maria, why don't you start?
All right. The Quran itself, of course, is a scripture. It's often referred to as a scripture, but it is really primarily an oral body of revelation. It is revealed to the Prophet Muhammad orally or verbally, and he himself, being traditionally illiterate according to Islamic teachings and Islamic reports, taught it to his followers also orally, and it's only much later that it comes to be written down. And in many ways, this accounts for that feature or quality I was talking about before, where it feels like a conversation. You feel like it's engaging you. You don't feel like it's telling you a story. When you read the Quran, you feel like it's telling you something about yourself, or asking you to think about yourself. And so that immediacy comes very much, or is very much related to the manner in which the Quran was revealed. So Islamic tradition teaches that the Prophet Muhammad grew up in Mecca, which was a primarily pagan or idolatrous culture that seems to have believed in one overarching creator God, whom they called Allah. Prophet Muhammad's father was Abdullah, the servant of Allah. So the name as a name of God was already there. But still, they worshipped other gods as well. And the tradition says that the Prophet Muhammad did not participate in this. And as a young man, a young adult, he would go off and meditate in caves in the mountains outside of Mecca. We don't know exactly what he did, but the tradition again tells us that he was inherently a monotheist, a Hanif, someone who followed an Abrahamic form of monotheism, one that was neither Jewish nor Christian. And on one of his retreats, you might say, into the cave, it said that in the middle of the night, one of the last 10 nights of Ramadan, one of the reasons Ramadan is such a sacred month, the angel Gabriel came to him actually in a rather violent manner, even grabbing him. Some accounts say grabbing him by the neck or grabbing him by the shoulders and shaking him and saying to him, recite or read, in Arabic, Iqra. And the prophet responds, makra, meaning either I don't read or what should I read? And so, depending on how you translate it. But in any case, he continues, the angel continues to command him to recite until the angel finally recites the first 5 verses that are revealed to the prophet. And again, these verses are very general. They're making him aware of the existence of God, who created human beings, who taught them what they know. And then the angel left, and Muhammad ran out of the cave, terrified, as one might after an experience like that. And it said, immediately ran down the mountain and saw the angel on the horizon, who then identified himself to the Prophet Muhammad as the angel Gabriel, who seems to have been someone already familiar to the Prophet Muhammad and maybe to the people of Mecca in general, as part of traditions of Judaism and Christianity that circulated throughout Arabia. And in any case, he still was concerned and afraid, and he came back home terrified and shaking. And the Quran recounts this indirectly, or makes mention of this. And it's really his wife, Khadija, who calms him down, who tells him that this is not something evil or satanic. You're not insane or possessed by jinn, which was something that was commonly discussed in Arabia at that time. And in fact, I don't know what this is, she said, but this must be something good because I know your character, Muhammad. I know you're a good person. And eventually, after he received more revelations, he came to understand, as well as talking with some people, predominantly Khadija's cousin Waraka, who was a Christian, talking with some other people and coming to realize that the messages he was receiving were indeed from God, and gradually understanding that they were very much connected to the traditions of Judaism and Christianity with which he was at least somewhat familiar.
So it was an oral revelation initially, a recitation, recite, Gabriel instructed Muhammad. This became a book. Joseph, why don't you give a little bit of the history about that? Because that occurred, for the most part, after the death of the prophet. Is that right?
Yes, it did. It's said that during the life of the prophet, there were several companions who did write down parts of the Quran on parchment or on the shoulder blades of dead camels, camel bones, or on date leaves and things like this. But most people could not read and write. And of course, writing materials weren't prevalent at that time. So it was mostly an oral tradition. And upon the death of the prophet, there was no official collection of the Quran. It is said that every year, the angel Gabriel would come to the prophet, peace be upon him, and would review the Quran. And that the order in which they would review the Quran every year was the order in which we now have it today. So when you go to a single surah of the Quran, sometimes the verses from one surah will have actually been revealed years apart from each other. And it was only by that arrangement, when they would review it every year, that we have it in the form that each chapter or surah came to be. In the year 634, under the Caliph Abu Bakr, the Muslims decided to collect the Quran all together in one place. Abu Bakr assigned Zayd bin Thabit with the task of getting everything together. It's said that before this, a few of the companions, 4 of them are mentioned by name, at least 4 companions had large compendiums of the Quran. Exactly how much they had gathered, we don't know, because we don't have those manuscripts with us. But there are several who had it. Nonetheless, Zayd bin Thabit was tasked with gathering everything together. And everything that he gathered together was then given to the Caliph Abu Bakr. And upon his death, it went to the next Caliph, Omar. And upon the death of Omar, it went to Omar's daughter, Hafsa, who was also a widow of the Prophet. Then in the year 650, by this time Islam was in places like Basra and Kufa in Iraq, up in Damascus and everything. So you start to have a problem that if one person starts reading the Quran and reciting it somewhat incorrectly in Basra or Kufa or both places, then all of a sudden those errors will continue to be repeated, and then people will start to lose the text of the Quran. So the Caliph Uthman wanted to unite the community on a single text, and he again assigned Zayd bin Thabit to collect the whole of the Quran and to, in a sense, cross-check it with everyone in the community and put it down in the right order. So the difference between what happened in 634 and what happened in 650 is that in 634, it's as if you gathered together all of your notes from a bunch of business meetings or from a class. You put them all in one place so that you knew that you had them. But then in 650, you gather them together, you check them against other people's notes, and you make sure that you have everything in the right order. And so this is what happened in 650, and that's what we call the consonantal skeleton of the text. It didn't have all of the dots that it has now to distinguish each of the consonants from one another, nor did it have all of the dashes that would mark the vowels on the text. And this text was then written down in multiple copies and sent, at least 4 of them were sent out to the major cities of the Islamic Empire at the time, and probably more. And then the Caliph Uthman ordered that all of the other manuscripts of the Quran be disposed of. This didn't necessarily happen. In fact, we have the record that one of the people who had collected a copy of the Quran before, Abdullah bin Mas'ud, objected that he had to burn his, and he did not. So, but nonetheless, the whole of the community was from that point forward, according to Islamic histories, unified upon a single text. But it's important to note that from this point forward, the oral tradition was still central. It's said in Islamic tradition that the written tradition and the oral tradition are cross-checks against one another, and neither one of them can be taken as an independent authority, but the two of them together serve to reinforce one another, and it's because of the two reinforcing one another that Muslims believe we have the accurate copy of what was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad today.
There was, in the news recently, the University of Birmingham, they discovered perhaps one of the oldest fragments of the Quran in the world.
Yes.
What do you think about that, Maria?
Well, it's interesting because the radiocarbon dating, of course, gives a range of dates, and the range goes, I believe, from 568 to, I think they said 658, and it's, of course, it's fascinating because if it is from, let's say, between from the 640s, right, or even the 630s, it represents a copy of the Quran that predates what the tradition tells us, or when the tradition tells us the Uthmani Codex that Joseph was just speaking about was collected. And in that case, it gives us evidence, first of all, that there were written Qurans or Quranic parts of the Quran in any case that existed prior to the Uthmani Codex. I mean, prior to this, some of the earliest fragments that were found were from a few decades later, around the 670s. And so this is the earliest one that has been found. And it's only 2 folios, and I've gone over it very, carefully. Of course, it is in a much older style. It's a clearly Meccan style, very well known. Again, a consonantal text without full dotting, and but nonetheless, I compared it, very carefully to the Quran we have now, and it is indeed identical, except for the different ways in which the dots and the vowels and so forth are marked. It's one of the issues that immediately then came up was people said, yes, but it could also be earlier than that. In fact, it might even predate the Prophet Muhammad himself, which would feed into certain revisionist arguments that some Quranic scholars have put forward, that the Quran drew upon earlier texts that were Christian, perhaps in origin. And, and this might be in that sense, or they might take this as possible evidence of that particular point of view. But I point out a couple of things, actually, that, of course, there's a lot of issues, technical issues. I'm not really an expert in radiocarbon dating. Apparently, they've tested the paper or the parchment rather than the ink. Mm-hmm. And of course, parchment could be reused, right? It could be wiped clean, right? So we don't know exactly. It's early, but we don't know. We can't really pinpoint a date well enough to make a dramatic argument about this predating somehow the Prophet Muhammad. But the other thing that's kind of interesting is that one of the pieces is from Surah Al-Kahf, the 18th surah of the Quran. And it's from a story that's being told about the companions of the cave, which is known in the Christian tradition as the seven sleepers of Ephesus, which is, of course, not a biblical tradition, but a Christian tradition. And there's something really unusual in the retelling of that story that the Quran gives. In the Christian account, for example, it says that the sleepers slept for 300 years before being miraculously awakened. In the Quranic text, it says they slept for 300 years plus 9. And that's a very significant point, because 309 years would be the lunar equivalent of 300 years in the solar calendar. Which means that this is not something that would have come from a Christian text. A Christian text would have been using a solar calendar.
Right.
This clearly is coming from a text written by people who have a lunar, who operate according to a lunar perspective, and therefore seems very natively from Arabia, at least.
I'm glad you brought up some of the polemical things that people would say about the origins of the text, because the Quran actually has a very interesting relationship to other scripture, the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian New Testament. And the word Islam itself, referring to submission to God, it's rooted in Abraham submitting his will to God, and the Quran talks about people of the book, which refers to Jews and Christians. So I'm interested, Joseph, why don't you talk about that element of things, about the Quran's relationship to the Bible?
Well, the Quran presents itself as very cognizant of being a continuation of the same tradition as the Hebrew scriptures and as the Gospels. It doesn't say New Testament itself. The 4 previous revelations that are mentioned by name in the Quran are what it refers to as the pages or scrolls of Abraham. And then it refers to the Torah, and it refers to the Psalms being sent to David, and it refers to the Injil or Gospel that was with Jesus. But also, it's important to note that Jesus is himself referred to in the Quran as a word of God. And some have said that from a Quranic perspective, Jesus himself is, in a sense, the revelation. Now, the Quran says over and over again that it confirms that which came before, and that the Prophet Muhammad is simply sent to confirm the message that previous messengers came, and that, in fact, he brings nothing new. And so, from a Quranic perspective, everything that's come through all of the prophets in all time is the same fundamental message. Nonetheless, the laws that different prophets have differ somewhat from time to time. You might say they fit more the circumstances in which people might find themselves at the time. And also the rites, or manasik, as the Quran calls them, are somewhat different within each religion. So one might say that it's a presentation where the form of the religions will differ, but the fundamental message of the religions is the same. Now, in history, of course, there are many aspects of it that we can't necessarily assess because we don't have lots of the archaeological information that we might want from a historical critical perspective. But this is how the Quran itself presents its relationship with the previous Abrahamic scriptures.
With some of the stories that it interacts with, for example, the figure of Noah appears in the Quran, and a lot of Christians that read the Bible today read that story in sort of a fundamentalist register, where they view this story as literal history, where there was a global flood that wiped out all of humankind except for Noah and his family. Does it show up similarly in the Quran? Is that the same type of story? Are there differences?
It is different, particularly in the sense that it doesn't have that universal, completely catastrophic element that you have in the biblical story. And the story is told in more than one place, as many of these stories are told, and told for different purposes. The story of Noah is really a story in the Quran, I should say, is really a story about his particular people, his group, his qawm in Arabic. It could be his city, his tribe in a sense, or his town, his small group of people where he was living. Well, we don't know how small it was, but it isn't universal. It's his particular people that are wiped out by the flood. And his story is often told in a sequence of other stories about people to whom God sent a prophet. But then they did not listen to the prophet. They rejected the teaching of the prophet. They refused to heed his warnings, and they were wiped out by earthquakes or other kind of devastating, what would seem to be natural events. And so the story of Noah is one of many of these stories that is told, and they're all told in a very similar way. So it's rendered in the context of other prophetic stories, and in a way that, again, reinforces the idea that God has sent many messengers to humanity. He sends them always with the same essential message, that there is one God, and that is the only God that they should listen to, and they need to behave ethically and morally, and when those prophets are rejected, then disaster eventually comes upon their people. And in a sense, it's this is kind of a side story, but having children, we have children, and you get sort of baby things. They always have this little Noah's Ark theme. We had Noah's Ark themed, stuffed animals and sheets. And
I actually had Noah's Ark wallpaper when I was little.
But when you read the biblical account, it's terrifying. It's not a children's story at all in many ways. So the Quranic account is, in a sense, less drastic, and it has the purpose of its telling is different.
Do you think most Muslims read it as a literal historical account, or are there some Muslims who will read it as more allegorical? I mean, contemporary scholarship shows that it has resonances with the Enuma Elish and other Babylonian stories and things. Are there Muslims who have more of a revisionist approach, where they'll accept the Quran as revealed, but they'll look at a story like when it's talking about Noah as being relating something that's actually not explicitly historical or anything like that?
The Quran is a very frustrating book for a historian. It's really difficult to find history and build it in that way. And it's one of the things that actually helps, you might say, prevent a literalist reading of the stories of some of these biblical figures. To go back to what Maria was saying about the story of Noah, it's really a very good example. You have really very little discussion of Noah's life, of the building of the ark. There's no discussion. The specifics,
like how many cubits to make it and stuff.
Exactly. Genesis 6, you have this discussion of the specifics. And then Genesis 9 tells the story after the flood. There's no discussion of that in the Quran. Rather, what you really have in the Quran is this discussion. It's said in the Quran, it says that Noah called his people for almost 1,000 years. And then God sent the flood. So really, in a sense, it's a story of how incredibly patient and merciful God is. That Noah called his people in one way, and they rejected that way. Then Noah went and he called his people in another way, They rejected him again. Then Noah went and called his people in another way. And he kept on doing it, and he kept on doing it, and he kept on doing it. And then, after more than 900 years, he finally said, okay, God, these people are misguided. Go ahead, have your way with them. But, I mean, if you really understand how long it is, and you even look and you read the language, there's a tendency sometimes when people read the Quran, you read phrases like, if only they were thankful, or if only they would think, or that they might reflect, and things like this. And people seem to read it as if God is angry. But really, if you read it as God is loving and God is merciful, it's more like a parent who would say for a child, if only he would think, if only they would reflect, they would see what I'm trying to do for them. And this comes out in so many of the Quranic stories, and I think Noah is a very good example of that. So while all of those stories that you might have in the Near Eastern milieu, it reflects those, Muslims don't see that as in any way taking away from the fact that it might be revelation. That actually even contributes to it, because from a Quranic perspective, God sends guidance to every single human collectivity. And so for other people to have known about this story, for similar stories to have been within civilization in many different ways, would actually fit in to the overall Quranic understanding of the relationship between the divine and the human.
Yeah, and it's this recurring story. And Joseph, you actually write about this in one of the essays in the study Quran, the Quranic view of sacred history and other religions, and you kind of situate the Quran as relating stories of prophets going all the way back to Adam. And there's even a sort of pre-existent Quran that was revelatory, but it's this cycle of to use, Mormons talk about a cycle of apostasy and restoration, and it seems to be that is a recurring theme within the Quran, that God is patient, that God sends revelation through a particular figure. Ultimately, that revelation is somehow discarded or disobeyed, and then things come to a head, and then they have to start over again. And then the Prophet Muhammad then is seen as sort of the seal of the prophets, kind of the final human manifestation or person who would receive that message. Is that right? That he's kind of viewed as the end point. Yeah, Maria. Being the seal of the prophet, yes. You talked about how one of the benefits of the Quran is it kind of shows how God is revealing things for particular circumstances, right? So Muhammad is addressing his contemporaries in terms of their paganism and calling them back to devotion to the one God, but him being the seal of the prophet then kind of locks Muslims into that text. Then that there's not an expectation of further revelation, correct?
That's right. Certainly not in that particular way. Not in the sense of sending an actual prophet. And in some ways, I think that, of course, this has been the basis for, in principle, Muslims can accept religions that came before, but it's harder for them to accept religions that came after if they're completely new, in the sense that the idea that there is that this is sort of the final time that God will speak to humanity. But that doesn't mean in a sense, and this is certainly something I find when I read the Quran, there's a way in which the Quran continues to be revealing, one might say. And just quickly to go back to the idea of the stories, one of the things that the Quran says at the end of the 6th surah, right before the surah, 7th surah, where many of these stories, as I was saying, beginning with Noah, are told in sequence. It talks about human beings being made khala'if fil ard, the sort of people who succeed one another continuously on the earth. And so, one group of people is given a message and they don't listen to the message, they're wiped out. Another group of people is given a chance, you might say, and maybe they succeed for a while or they don't succeed at all and they're wiped out. And then there's another group of people. And, after relating these stories, the Quran will often say, well, that's what they did. You're not going to be asked about what they've done. And so it's not doing this in order to tell you something so much about the past, but it's a way of saying, now it's your turn. Now you're the Khalifa. Now you're the generation that has inherited the earth, and how are you going to respond? And so there's a way in which, again, because of the immediacy of the way the Quran is revealed, there's a sense that it does continue to speak directly to every new generation.
Let's talk about some of the other main themes of the Quran. And Maria wrote one of the essays here that I enjoyed that's kind of about social justice and ethics in the Quran. And one of the things, Maria, that you point out at the beginning of that is that it's been difficult for people to wrap their heads around what sort of ethics are promoted in the Quran, because the Quran is not a systematic treatise, as you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, that it comes in waves, it comes in flashes of insight, and different points are being made. There's complexity there. So it's quite easy, I think, for people to selectively proof text from the Quran, find a surah or an ayat that sort of seems very violent or very strange, and to kind of pull that out of its context and present that as the message of the Quran. So this essay that you write is sort of trying to complicate that and make it more difficult to read it so shallowly. So talk about some of the themes. Some that you write about in terms of social justice include patriarchy, the treatment of women, and violence, and things like that. So I'd like to hear more from you on that, on those subjects.
Sure. First of all, let me just say that one of the reasons why this is an essay on Islamic ethics and not necessarily on law per se, there is a very widespread misperception that the Quran is a book of law. And this misperception is based, I think, in part on the fact that Islam as a religion is a very legally based religion. And of course, the Sharia is extraordinarily important to Muslims. It refers to not just law, but in fact to their whole way of life. So for that reason, there is this sense, the Sharia is based on the Quran, which of course it is. And so therefore the Quran must be a book of law, when in fact that's not the case. There's only about 200 verses or so of the Quran that give distinct legal rulings. Whereas there are over 6,200 verses in the Quran itself. And the other thing is the legal text, or where you do find legal rulings, are in the Medinan verses almost exclusively, with the exception of some dietary laws that appear in Meccan verses. But almost all of the rulings that have to do with social issues, marriage or divorce, family relations, criminal law, economic or commercial practices, and so on. All of those things are found in the Medinan verses, because when the Prophet Muhammad was in Medina, that's when he was not just in Mecca. He was just the leader of a small persecuted religious minority. But once he gets to Mecca, he very shortly becomes, in effect, the ruler of that city, and so is in a position, therefore, to create and structure a society based on those principles that the Quran was teaching. And so, and the Medinan verses are, of course, it's not perfectly even, but the Medinan verses tend to be concentrated toward the first part of the Quran. And so, for example, the second, third, and fourth surahs, which are all very, very long, some of the longest surahs in the Quran, they are Medinan. And so these Medinan verses, so when people pick up the Quran, I should say, and they read from the beginning of the Quran, they might see, even then it's going to be interspersed with other things, but they might see more law and legal rulings than they would if they actually started from the back of the Quran. I often tell people to start from the back, because that's where you find, you might say, the moral and ethical principles that are actually referenced far more often, and really are the context in which these legal rulings have to be understood. And so in the essay, I do begin by saying that, you may agree or disagree with the particular rulings that you find in the Quran, or the way marriage or divorce or family relations are structured and so on. You may very much disagree with those. But at the same time, it's important to understand that they are framed within an ethical context, and their purpose is indeed moral in nature. It's about constructing a society where everyone is taken care of, where people are not exploited, where there is unity and harmony to the extent possible. These are where everyone is bound by certain rights and responsibilities. And this is a kind of the framework in which many of these laws have to be understood. And of course, the very important issue of justice and charity and generosity and forgiveness. These things are constantly reiterated in the Quran. And at the same time, of course, the Quran is revealed in the 7th century, a time when throughout pretty much the known civilized world at that time, things like patriarchy or slavery were widespread. Islam doesn't bring patriarchy, it doesn't bring slavery to a community that had not known those things, but in fact is coming into a situation where those things are understood to be normative, perhaps even unchangeable. And so although that structure, I know there have been a lot of Islamic feminists or female writers, and they may not consider themselves feminists, who would argue that the Quran is ultimately not patriarchal. And I think indeed it is trying to undermine to some extent, well, at least to amend the patriarchal structure such that it is not so unjust for women. But nonetheless, that patriarchal element in a few places comes out fairly clearly. But again, I think what's really important when you look at the Quran, you have to look at it on the one hand honestly and look at what it says, but you also have to look at it holistically. And there are many places where the Quran seems particularly concerned to uphold the rights, or to, it wouldn't have even been seen as rights at that time, but to amend and improve the situation of women at that time, and to prevent particular kinds of forms of exploitation and abuse that they would otherwise have been regularly subject to.
That's Maria Dakake. She's an associate professor and chair of the Religious Studies Department at George Mason University. She specializes in Islamic thought, Quranic studies, Shiite and Sufi traditions, and women's issues. She's also co-director of Interdisciplinary Islamic Studies program at George Mason. And recently she worked together with Joseph Lumbard and others on the Study Quran. They assist with the translation, commentary, and other matters within that book. Joseph, I wanted to turn to you to talk a little bit about the translation of this particular edition, the makeup of the HarperOne edition, how long it took, and some of the translation issues that cropped up along the way, because there's a saying that goes, the Quran cannot be translated. The true Quran is in Arabic. Any translation is simply a translation of that true Quran. And so let's talk about some of those issues that come up when you're producing a translation.
Well, that's a very good question. I don't know if one could really say that it's one of the most difficult books to translate, considering that you have a new translation coming out just about every year now. But in our translation in particular, when we first set out to do the text, we thought that we were going to use an existing translation and write our commentary upon it. In other words, we had the model that you have with most, not all, but most of the study Bibles that are out there.
Yeah, like the Jewish Annotated New Testament uses the NRSV. So they just,
the Jewish Annotated New Testament uses the NRSV. The Jewish Study Bible uses a pre-existing translation. Yes. The same with the HarperCollins Study Bible, Oxford Annotated, etc. But as we went through all of the translations,
this was about 10 years ago that you started this, right?
Yeah, we started this. We first started this in January of 2006.
Okay, so you're going through these translations, sort of trying to decide.
Yes, and then we met, and we were all at a conference together, and we made the fateful decision that there weren't any that we could use as a text for a study Quran. What we wanted was something that is accurate, consistent, and eloquent. We actually developed an Excel word chart in which every word of the Quran is located and every commonly recurring phrase is found, so that we could track how we were translating everything and keep track of our workflow. We didn't use this to make sure that everything was always the same. In fact, what we used it for is to register when we had agreed that certain words in different contexts would need to be rendered somewhat differently. But we did this to make sure that we had consistency and to keep track of agreements that we had made. The workflow was that each of the general editors, myself, Maria, and Janer Dale, who's at the College of the Holy Cross, we would each translate a part of the Quran, so each of us was responsible for about a third, and then we would share that with the other general editors. We would go through a process where we would get the feedback from the other general editors, then sometimes discuss a few of the issues, differences that we might have. And after we had gone through that discussion, then a final edited version of that, with some notes regarding disagreements that might still persist, would be sent to the editor-in-chief. He would go through that, and then we would get that back, and then we would again, the primary translator would go over that part, and if there were any important editorial things or any differences of opinion had been settled, report that back to everyone else. But that was just the first step. Then once we had everything down, and we really got even deeper into it when we were going into the commentary, we found even more inconsistencies. And we ended up developing about hundreds of translation memos that would have everything in Arabic and in English and all the different instances of it, so that we could go through it and sit down and make an agreement about how we would need to work with particular phrases and particular words, so that even if we couldn't have a direct equivalence in each instance, there would be consistency in how we were dealing with particular terms. This, by the way, is, I think, part of what does set this translation apart. If you go through the history of Quran translation, it is very different from the history of Bible translation, in that almost every translation that's out there is an individual effort of the Quran, that is. And now, I hope that we are starting a trend where translations of the Quran will be done by academic committees. And hopefully there'll be more translations done by academic committees, because there are certainly other ways to do it than what we did. But we do think that what we have developed is a translation that works very well for a study Quran, especially because it is consistent and accurate throughout.
With this translation, and with any translation from the original, there's a sense that much of the original can be lost in translation, because one of the things Muslims appreciate most about the Quran is its beauty, its structure. That itself serves as a sign of its being a revelation to Muhammad. The fact that this person couldn't have sat down and wrote this document. This is something that was revealed. So what are some of the syntax and grammar things that get lost in a translation from Arabic to a language like English?
Well, I would say that a lot of it has to do with the richness of the Arabic vocabulary. And so, words have multiple meanings, and those meanings, there's a tradition that some commentators will say that, certainly mystical commentators will say, the Quran can have Quranic verses, each verse can have many, many interpretations. And any grammatically accurate interpretation is one thing that God meant to communicate through that verse. But I can give you, one example. There's a word, method, which can mean example, likeness, parable. It has a wide range of meanings. And, we did try, as Joseph explained, to be as consistent as possible, so that, people would be able to read this and say or see, even people who, let's say didn't have access to the Arabic and wanted to make a study of how a particular word or term is used in the Quran, they could at least do it a study at some level, because we would try to be consistent in the terminology. Methil is one of those words that completely defeated us in this. And we realized that we struggled to find one English word that would fit all these contexts, and it it did not. But you see, that already says something about the differences in language. There is a single word in Arabic that connotes in the mind of someone who knows Arabic all of those things simultaneously. And that there's no way to represent that in English. Another quick example, there's a word that the Quran uses, which is ta'wil. And ta'wil is usually understood to mean interpretation. And in discussing the Quran as the history of Quranic interpretation developed, sometimes people made a distinction. Ta'wil was one of the earliest words that was used for this process of interpreting the Quran, and that's because it is a Quranic term itself, and an important one. But there came to be a distinction between two terms, tafsir, which is what is usually used for Muslim commentaries or interpretations of the Quran, exegesis. And tafsir really means to explain something in detail. Ta'wil is a word that means, its etymological meaning is to bring something back to its origin, or to know how something is going to turn out in the end. And so this term is used in many ways in the Quran, I should say in different ways in the Quran, but always it includes, the term always means both interpretation and the fullness of the meaning of something that might only make itself known over time. So for example, the story of the prophet Joseph, which will be familiar to Jewish and Christian audiences, he has these dreams in the Quran, just as in the biblical account, that of course foreshadow what's going to happen to him and to his brothers in the end. But he doesn't know what they mean at the beginning, right? He only knows what those dreams mean when everything comes to fruition and he ends up in charge in Egypt and his brothers come to visit him and so on. Only then does the full understanding of that dream, the full interpretation of those dreams are made known to him. But it's also the ta'wil, in the sense it's the way those things turn, the full meaning that unfolds over time. And so in the beginning of Surah 3, it says that the ta'wil of the Quran is known only to God, or in some readings, known only to God and those who are firmly grounded in knowledge, which can mean God, it's only God or God and those people who know the true interpretation of the Quran. But it can also mean they're the only ones who know the fullness of the meaning that will be revealed over time. So again, it's a word that, in order to appreciate what it means within the context of the Quran, you need to have its full semantic range, you might say, naturally in your head. And we try to do that through the commentary. We would point these things out in the commentary. But in that sense, it's still going to be fragmented in a way that it wouldn't be for someone who understands the language, and all of these meanings would be present to them.
Not only the polyvalence of some of these words, there's also just the baggage that some words carry. Joseph mentions this in his chapter on the Quran and translation, and that's the word din. Is that how it's pronounced?
Deen.
Deen. So that's religion, and religion from the Western context, they're talk about trying to find the roots of that word, and some people root it in the idea to treat something carefully. Some people root it in the idea to bind, so we're bound to God, we bind ourselves to God. Religion, we're tied to God. But the Arabic root for deen, it kind of comes from not a totally different, but a different kind of place, where it talks about being to owe a debt, to be obedient, to follow. Human beings are in debt to God. So even not only do some of these words just have multiple meanings, but there's also instances of words where in English they carry this baggage. People hear religion, they think an organized church or something like that. Whereas throughout the Quran, that same word could actually be talking about just owing a debt to God, being obedient to God, perhaps even pointing to the idea of submitting to God. So there's so many things that I wish we had more time to talk about, but I wanted to also ask about the one of the things that Joseph, you write in this essay, is the Quran cannot be translated on the linguistic plane. That you're writing this, in a book that is a translation of the Quran. It cannot be translated on the linguistic plane. The only true translation of the Quran possible is of an existential order. Only those who have assimilated the revelation or immersed themselves in its teachings so thoroughly that its meanings speak through their thoughts, words, and deeds can be said to represent an effective translation of the noble book. It seems to me that you're saying here, rather than being so concerned about translating the Quran, the reader should actually seek to be translated by the Quran, by taking in its message, its ideals, its teachings.
Yeah, and that's really what the Quran tells one over and over again as one goes over the Quran. There's a tradition now where the Quran is memorized by many people throughout the Islamic world. But that's considered what we call in Islam a sufficient obligation, meaning that if there are people who are preserving the Quran, it's not something everybody has to do. But everybody who is a Muslim has to try to live in accord with the Quran to the best of their ability. And so over and over again, the Quran says, do you not understand? Do you not reflect? Do they not contemplate the Quran, or do their hearts have their locks upon them? And the Quran will say in many instances, none understand this save those who are possessed of intellect. And every single time the Quran is challenging you to go deeper into its message, understand it more, and live in accord with it. It's said that during the life of the Prophet, many of the companions of the Prophet, they would only memorize 10 verses of the Quran at a time, and then they wouldn't memorize anything more until they had learned how to act upon and implement those verses that they had memorized. Once they knew how to implement them, then they would go and memorize 10 more verses. But this is something that to some degree you might say is lost in the emphasis upon memorization that you find in some parts of the Islamic world today.
It's fascinating. Like you say, the idea is that this text is going, this book is going to translate you in the process of engaging with it. Is this how most Muslims engage with the text? Do you picture Muslims sitting down with the study Quran and reading through it and meditating upon it, or how do Muslims usually encounter the text? With Christians, they'll sit down and read different chapters, or they'll have favorite verses that they might memorize, or do studies of different stories. How do most Muslims engage with the Quran itself? How do you see this translation being used?
Well, I would say, first of all, as you may know, the basic content of the Muslim prayer are passages or parts of the Quran. And so every Muslim has to memorize at least a certain number of small Quranic passages in order to be able to say their prayers properly. And so most Muslims will memorize, a good number of verses so that they can repeat different verses, or different passages, I should say, not just verses, but different passages in their prayers. A lot of young children, when they're Muslim, at a very early age, they will have to, what they'll call, read the whole Quran. And that's where they actually work on learning how to read to actually recite from, looking at the text, how to recite the Quranic text. And sometimes that includes memorization, and sometimes it's simply learning how to read the entire text. And one of the things about Arabic, I often say it's the only thing about Arabic that is easy, is that it's phonetic. And so once you learn what the different consonants and vowels mean and so forth, anyone can sit down and read the Quran, even if they don't know what it is saying. Right? They don't actually know its content necessarily. But at the same time, many Muslims will continue throughout their lives to read the Quran on a regular basis, not just in prayers, but also as maybe a regular practice to read a few pages a day, of the Quran during Ramadan. You may know that the Quran is Muslims have divided the Quran into 30 equal sections, and this way people can read the entire Quran in a month. A lot of people like to do that during the month of Ramadan because it's the month in which the Quran was revealed. But at the same time, I think there is, and for good traditional reasons, you might say, there's a lot of hesitance on the part of Muslims to engage entirely with the meaning of the text, whether by reading a translation or if they are capable of reading the Arabic text itself. And they feel that very much they should depend upon traditional scholars for the interpretation of the Quran. I teach a class on the Quran regularly at my university, where I'm based in Northern Virginia, where there's a huge Muslim community. And so when I teach courses on the Quran, usually 50 to 75% of the class come in one way or another from a Muslim background, whether or not they're observant. And if we're looking at a passage of the Quran, I'll often say to them, what do you think this means? And I've gotten the response in the past, well, it's not for us to say what it means. We need to look at what the traditional commentators say that it means. And I think, on the one hand, this is true, of course, you don't want sort of interpretive anarchy.
Right.
The Quran can't mean everything. But at the same time, I do think that the Quran asks for its listeners and its readers to personally engage with the text. There's a passage that says, "Why do you not contemplate this Quran?" Right? So it's very directly asking the reader to do that. But there's a kind of hesitation because people are afraid that they'll interpret something incorrectly. And so one of the things that I hope that this will do is now a Muslim can look at an English who, let's say, is not an Arabic speaker or might be, but can't access the traditional commentaries. They can look and they say, well, this is what I think this verse means when I read it. And now I can look at the commentary and I can say, what have the traditional commentators said about this? And they can see in some cases, in many cases, the interpretation, is pretty uniform across the tradition. But for other verses, there might be a multitude of interpretations. And then they can look at that. They can engage with that. They can see that Muslims themselves discussed and thought about what these verses might mean and didn't always come to the same conclusions. They can feel safe that there's a kind of guideline if they don't feel safe doing it on their own, I can look at what these traditional commentators say, but also I think in some ways opens it up for them to have a more personal engagement, more thoughtful and contemplative engagement with the text.
Yeah, there's a sense in which this version, the study Quran itself, is really presented to Muslims in particular, also for people of other faiths to get to know Islam better. But there was a decision made early on for the scholars involved in the project to be believing Muslims, that it would be a project by believing Muslims. And Joseph, I wanted to have you expand on that a little bit, talk about the decision to include only believing Muslims on that, and also the place of non-Muslims in scholarship about Islam in general.
Well, I think the decision to have only Muslims on the project was that of the editor-in-chief himself, and it's something that I agree with in large part. And the reason I agree with it is because it really is our responsibility to present Islam to non-Muslims and to the broader non-Arabic reading Muslim audience, which is the vast majority of Muslims. Amy Jill Levine put this very well when I was attending a presentation that she did for the Jewish commentary on the New Testament, when she said that reclaiming our history and retelling our story is our responsibility and our right, and that doing so counteracts many of the effects of colonialism. I think that everything that she is saying there as regards the Jewish tradition applies completely and even more so to the Islamic tradition. Thus far, there hasn't been the opportunity for Muslims to fully, in a sense, tell their story within the Western context. There's too much noise around it, and I think that this volume will be an important step towards that, one of the things that we should reflect upon, where we sit today, is a very interesting point in history where English has quite unexpectedly become an international language of Islamic intellectual discourse. And therefore, to have a study Quran that comes out in English is not just something that's important within English-speaking countries such as Australia, America, the UK, etc., but really has the potential for important international impact.
That's Joseph Lumbard. He's a professor in the Department of Arabic and Translation Studies at the American University of Sharjah. And he's written and translated articles on and books on Islamic philosophy, Sufism, Quranic studies. And he's also served as an advisor for interfaith affairs to the Jordanian royal court. Together with Maria Dakake, they are general editors of the Study Quran from HarperOne. You can read more about the Study Quran. You can download some sample pages from it at thestudyquran.com. We'll take a brief break and be right back with the conclusion of this episode.
According to the Maxwell Institute's new book, Schooling the Prophet, Joseph Smith wasn't merely the Book of Mormon's prophetic translator. He was also a student of that sacred record. Author Gerald E. Smith argues that the prophet was quietly influenced by one of the most important sources he knew, the Book of Mormon, on doctrine, priesthood, and temple matters. Don't miss the book Terrell Given says motivates readers to keep plumbing the Book of Mormon's riches. Learn more about Schooling the Prophet, how the Book of Mormon influenced Joseph Smith and the early restoration at bit.ly/schoolingtheprophet and at amazon.com.
It's the Maxwell Institute podcast. I'm Blair Hodges. Today, we're speaking with Maria Dakake and Joseph Lumbard. Together, they worked as translators, commentary authors, and as general editors for HarperOne's Study Quran, which is coming out in November. You can read more about that book at thestudyquran.com. I've also put links up on the Maxwell Institute's website. So I wanted to conclude this interview by going back to the beginning, the opening surah of the Quran, which is called The Opening. And invite Joseph, if you would recite that, and then have Maria read the translation and talk for a minute about this opening portion of the text. So, Joseph, if you would, that would be great.
I'm happy to do so with the one caveat that I am not a professional reciter.
And there are like really professional reciters, right? I mean, there are even competitions
indeed.
where people can win awards for beauty, accuracy. What kind of things do they judge it on?
Accuracy is first and foremost, and then there's also beauty as well. But one of the main things is to be accurate and to know the rules of recitation, and then to be able to implement them really perfectly. It's really very, very technical to be able to recite the Quran just right.
Okay, so with that caveat, this isn't a competition, but you'll give us a really good idea of what this sounds like. So here's the opening.
الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
Thank you. That was excellent. And then, Maria, why don't you read the translation of this? Who did this one, by the way? Who did this translation?
Joseph did.
Oh, good. Okay, so Maria, read Joseph's translation then of this opening surah.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Praise be to God, Lord of the worlds, the compassionate, the merciful. Master of the day of judgment. Thee we worship, and from thee we seek help. Guide us upon the straight path, the path of those whom thou hast blessed, not of those who incur wrath, nor of those who are astray.
So that's the entirety of that opening surah. And what's interesting to me is you then include about 7 pages of commentary on that. And what's interesting is there are volumes that have been written about just this opening surah. So how did you decide what to fit in there? And we'll close by talking about some of your favorite elements of the commentary on this opening. Maria, why don't you start, and then we'll have Joseph.
Well, could I actually say something, since I'm
Sure.
technically credited with writing the commentary on this? However, the commentary for this particular surah was done a little bit differently than all the others. In all of the others, we would go off and we would kind of do our thing and look in the commentaries and present it to everyone else after we finished the research and writing. For this one, since it was the opening one, the first thing that we did was we had a group discussion about what should be included. And then after we had that group discussion, I wrote the commentary. So it really, this particular commentary is more of a group endeavor than many of the other commentaries.
And that said, how do you decide how to boil it down? In addition to the commentary, there's also about 2 pages of introductory material as well.
Right, and I would say that this verse, although it is this passage, this surah, even though it's very small, it is repeated by Muslims continuously. It functions for Muslims in a way that's very similar, for example, to the Lord's Prayer in Christianity. And people have pointed out that there are some similarities in terms of its tone and the attitude it takes toward God. But it's when Muslims pray, every prayer has a certain number of cycles in it. So the morning prayer has 2 cycles in it, the content of the prayer itself. Sometimes people will do additional cycles, but there's 2 cycles in the morning prayer and 4 in the 2 afternoon prayers and 3 in the evening, at sunset, and 4 in the evening. And so each one of these cycles of prayer includes and begins with a recitation of this passage. So this is something that every Muslim, even a small child, by the age of 3, living in a household where people are praying all the time, will just learn by heart from hearing it repeated so many times. And then Muslims say it at many other times as well. So it really is, it kind of defines and encapsulates the attitude of the human soul toward God from a Muslim perspective.
Joseph, what sticks out to you about this and what you all elected to focus on in the commentary?
Well, I have to say, it was really a privilege to work on this particular commentary. And as I went through the different commentaries that are out there, one of the reasons there are so many extensive commentaries is because there are sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, which say that it is the most important surah. And there's a famous saying which says that everything that is in the Quran is found in the Fatiha, and everything that is in the Fatiha is in the first sentence of it, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, and everything that's in that is within the bab that it begins with. But as one goes through it, one really does see that there's a degree to which this is, you can really see how this works. Because, for example, if you look at what is verse 3, the compassionate, the merciful, right before it, verse 2 says, praise be to God, the Lord of the worlds. Verse 4 says, master of the day of judgment. When you say that God is the Lord of the worlds, you are saying that God encompasses all space. When you say that God is master of the day of judgment, you are alluding to the manner in which God governs all time. And when you are saying that God is the compassionate and the merciful, right between those, it's a way of saying that God's compassion and God's mercy interpenetrates all space and all time. And that is one of the central messages that you have throughout the entire Quran. is that God is merciful and compassionate, that God wants to forgive, that God wants to even annul all of your sins, so long as you turn to God. As one verse of the Quran says, God does not change what is in a people until they change what is in themselves. But part of the implication is that if you do change what is in yourself, that God will help you do that more and more and more as you progress.
That's Joseph Lumbard. He's a professor in the Department of Arabic and Translation Studies at the American University of Sharjah. And we're also speaking with Maria Dakake today. She's Associate Professor and Chair of Religious Studies Department at George Mason University. Thanks, both of you, for coming on the show. The study Quran looks beautiful. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much for having us, Blair.